There's something chilling about the moment you realize that the people closest to you, the ones who claim to care about you the most, are quietly keeping score. They remember every favor they've done for you. They catalog every sacrifice they've made. They measure every moment you've taken their attention, their energy, their time. And somewhere in the dark corners of their minds, a resentment is growing that they'll never admit, not even to themselves. You thought their love was unconditional. You believed their support came from genuine care. But what if the very people who say they love you are actually keeping a psychological ledger, and you've been racking up debt without knowing it? What if every act of kindness they've shown you came with invisible strings attached? Strings they're now pulling tighter around your throat. Alice Miller, the renowned psychoanalyst who spent her career exposing the hidden dynamics of family relationships, understood something most people refuse to see: that love and resentment often coexist in the same heart. The person who claims to love you most may also be the one who resents you most deeply, and they've become masterful at hiding this resentment behind a mask of care, concern, and sacrifice. This isn't about obvious enemies or declared adversaries. This is about the people who sleep in your bed, share your dinner table, call you family, claim you as their closest friend. These are the people who have access to your vulnerabilities, who know your insecurities, who understand exactly where to apply pressure when they want to remind you of your debt to them. The most dangerous form of resentment is the kind that wears the mask of love. Because when someone hates you openly, you can defend yourself. But when someone resents you while claiming to care about you, you become trapped in a psychological maze where every attempt to address the problem is met with denial, gaslighting, and accusations that you're ungrateful, paranoid, or imagining things. Love, in its purest form, asks for nothing in return. But most people don't love purely. They love with conditions, expectations, and invisible contracts that you never signed but are somehow expected to honor. Every kindness becomes an investment. Every gesture of care comes with compound interest. And you, without realizing it, have become indebted to people who never told you there was a price. The moment someone starts keeping track of what they've done for you, love dies and transaction begins. But they'll never tell you they're keeping score. Instead, they'll present their sacrifices as gifts, their efforts as voluntary, their investment in you as selfless devotion. Only later, when they need something from you, will you discover that nothing was actually free. Alice Miller wrote extensively about how parents often treat children as emotional investments, expecting returns on their care in the form of gratitude, obedience, and psychological servicing. But this dynamic extends far beyond parent-child relationships. Friends, partners, siblings, colleagues, anyone can turn love into a ledger when their own emotional needs aren't being met elsewhere. Consider how this plays out in everyday interactions. They offer to help you move, but 6 months later, they're bringing it up when they need a favor. They listen to your problems for hours, but suddenly, you're being reminded of their emotional labor when you can't do the same for them. They support you through a difficult time, but now every disagreement includes a reference to how much they've done for you. The insidious part is how reasonable it all sounds. Of course, people should be appreciated. Of course, relationships should be reciprocal. Of course, there should be some balance. But healthy relationships don't require constant auditing. They don't need scorekeeping. When someone truly loves you, their care doesn't come with receipts. What creates this transactional approach to love? Usually, it's people who never received unconditional care themselves. They learned early that affection was earned, not given. They discovered that love was conditional on performance, behavior, and usefulness. So now they replicate this pattern, offering care that feels generous on the surface, but carries hidden costs underneath. The tragedy is that you can feel this resentment building even when you can't name it. You notice the slight edge in their voice when they talk about things they've done for you. You sense the expectation in their kindness. You feel the weight of obligation in their generosity. But because they never explicitly state their expectations, You're left feeling guilty, confused, and somehow always in the wrong. The relationship becomes a constant negotiation where you're always trying to balance books you didn't know were being kept. You find yourself thanking them repeatedly, apologizing for things that shouldn't require apologies, and feeling perpetually indebted to people who claim they're giving freely. The love that should nourish you becomes a burden that exhausts you. Some people are addicted to being needed. They rush to rescue others, solve problems that weren't theirs to solve, and insert themselves into situations where they weren't asked to intervene. They present themselves as helpers, supporters, and saviors. But beneath this compulsive giving lies a deep well of resentment toward the very people they claim to be helping. Harriet Lerner, in her groundbreaking work on relationship patterns, identified this as the over-functioning dynamic. Overfunctioners take on responsibilities that belong to others, anticipate needs before they're expressed, and solve problems before they're even fully formed. They appear generous and caring, but their helping comes with a psychological cost that the recipient never agreed to pay. The person who constantly rescues you doesn't actually want you to become independent. They want you to remain dependent because your dependence feeds their sense of purpose, identity, and control. But simultaneously, they resent you for needing them. They resent the burden they voluntarily took on. They resent that you haven't become self-sufficient despite all their help. They resent that their sacrifices haven't transformed you into the person they think you should be. This creates a psychological double bind that's impossible to escape. If you accept their help, you're taking advantage of them. If you refuse their help, you're ungrateful and pushing them away. If you try to become more independent, you're rejecting their love. If you remain dependent, you're proving their point that you're helpless. There's no way to win because the game itself is rigged. Watch how these people talk about the help they provide. They never just say, "I helped Sarah move." They say, "I spent my entire weekend helping Sarah move, and I had to cancel my own plans, and my back still hurts." They don't simply mention lending money. They provide detailed accounts of how much they sacrificed to give it. The help always comes with a narrative of their own suffering attached. What they're really communicating is that your problems are burdens they bear. Your needs are inconveniences they endure. Your struggles are evidence of your inadequacy, and their help is proof of their superiority. They position themselves as the strong one and you as the weak one, which allows them to feel important while simultaneously resenting the role they've assigned themselves. The most damaging aspect of this dynamic is how it erodes your confidence and self-efficacy. When someone constantly rescues you, they send the implicit message that you can't handle things yourself. When they solve problems you didn't ask them to solve, they undermine your own problem-solving abilities. When they anticipate your needs before you've even identified them, they prevent you from developing emotional awareness and self-reliance. Harriet Lerner observed that overfunctioners often create underfunctioners, people who become increasingly dependent because their opportunities for growth and autonomy have been systematically removed. Then the overfunctioner resents the very dependence they've cultivated, creating a cycle where both people become trapped in roles that no longer serve them. The resentment grows because the helper realizes on some level that their helping hasn't actually helped. You haven't become the grateful, transformed person they expected. You haven't showered them with the appreciation they felt they deserved. Instead, you've remained human, flawed, struggling, and sometimes even more confused than before their intervention. Sometimes the people who resent you most aren't angry about what you've done. They're angry about what you represent. Your happiness reminds them of their misery. Your success highlights their failures. Your freedom exposes their self-imposed limitations. Your very existence becomes a mirror, reflecting back everything they wish they had, but don't believe they deserve. Otto Kernberg, whose work on narcissistic personality patterns revealed the deep psychology of envy, understood that some people can't tolerate others having what they lack. It's not just that they want what you have, it's that your having it feels like proof that they can't have it themselves. Your joy becomes evidence of their joylessness. Your peace becomes a reminder of their internal chaos. This isn't conscious resentment. They don't wake up thinking, "I hate that she's happy." Instead, they find themselves inexplicably irritated by your good news. They feel compelled to point out potential problems with your successes. They have an urgent need to remind you of previous failures whenever you're celebrating current victories. They love you, they insist, but somehow your happiness always seems to bring out their worst impulses. The person who struggles with depression may resent your natural optimism, even while claiming they want you to be happy. The person trapped in an unfulfilling job may feel bitter about your career satisfaction, even while saying they're proud of you. The person who can't maintain relationships may secretly harbor resentment toward your stable partnership, even while offering relationship advice. What makes this particularly destructive is how it gets disguised as concern. "I just don't want you to get your hopes up too high. I'm worried you're not being realistic. Are you sure you're making the right choice?" They frame their resentment as protection, their envy as wisdom, their bitterness as caring guidance. Otto Kernberg noted that this type of envy often emerges in people who have never learned to tolerate their own painful emotions. Instead of feeling and processing their disappointment, loneliness, or fear, they project these feelings onto others. Your success becomes threatening because it forces them to confront what they haven't achieved. Your happiness becomes irritating because it highlights their own emotional poverty. The most insidious aspect of this dynamic is how it makes you responsible for their emotional regulation. You start downplaying your successes to avoid triggering their negativity. You minimize your happiness to prevent their resentment. You edit your life to make it more palatable to their wounded psychology. Without realizing it, you become smaller to accommodate their inability to tolerate your fullness. They may not even understand why they feel compelled to diminish your experiences. They genuinely believe they're being helpful when they point out the potential downsides of your good news. They think they're being realistic when they remind you of past failures. They're convinced they're protecting you when they express skepticism about your dreams. But underneath all this care is a deeper psychological truth. Your thriving forces them to confront their own stagnation. The resentment builds because they can't admit, even to themselves, that your well-being threatens their psychological equilibrium. Instead, they find ways to make you question your own experiences. They plant seeds of doubt about your decisions. They bring up past mistakes when you're feeling confident. They find subtle ways to deflate your enthusiasm while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. This creates a relationship where your growth and happiness become sources of tension rather than celebration. The people who claim to love you most become the ones most invested in keeping you at their emotional level. They can't rise to meet your joy, so they need you to descend to match their suffering. Some people don't love you. They love what you provide for them. Your emotions, your attention, your energy, your validation, your problem-solving abilities, your listening skills, your caretaking functions. You've become what psychologists call narcissistic supply, a resource that feeds their psychological needs while slowly depleting your own reserves. Arnold Cooper, whose work on narcissistic relationships revealed the hidden power dynamics in seemingly loving connections, understood that some people are incapable of seeing others as separate individuals with their own needs, feelings, and autonomy. Instead, they see others as extensions of themselves, objects that exist primarily to provide emotional regulation, validation, and psychological maintenance. When you serve this function for someone, their love for you is actually dependency disguised as affection. They need you to listen to their problems, validate their perspectives, admire their achievements, and provide emotional soothing when they're distressed. But they don't particularly care about your problems, your perspectives, your achievements, or your need for emotional support. The relationship is fundamentally one-sided, even when it appears mutual on the surface. The resentment builds because maintaining this dynamic requires enormous emotional energy from you, while they remain largely oblivious to the cost. They expect you to be available when they need you, understanding when they're difficult, patient when they're demanding, and forgiving when they're hurtful. But when you need the same consideration, they're often unavailable, distracted, or actively annoyed by your needs. Watch how conversations flow in these relationships. When they're speaking, you're expected to be fully present, asking follow-up questions, offering support, and providing the emotional response they're seeking. But when you try to share something important, they quickly redirect the conversation back to themselves, offer superficial advice designed to end the discussion, or become visibly impatient with your need for attention. Arnold Cooper observed that people who use others as narcissistic supply often develop a profound sense of entitlement to that supply. They believe you owe them your attention, your emotional labor, your psychological servicing. When you fail to provide it, because you're tired, stressed, busy, or simply human, they react with disproportionate anger, hurt, or passive-aggressive punishment. The most damaging aspect of this dynamic is how it inverts the normal flow of reciprocity in relationships. Instead of mutual exchange, you become the primary giver, while they become the primary receiver. But because they're skilled at framing this as normal, loving behavior, you often don't recognize the imbalance until you're already emotionally exhausted. They may express love for you, but it's the love one has for a valuable possession rather than the love one has for an autonomous person. They love how you make them feel, what you do for them, how you serve their psychological needs. But they don't love you as a separate individual with your own inner world, your own struggles, your own need for care and consideration. If this content is revealing patterns you recognize in your own relationships, if you're starting to see how your emotional energy has been systematically harvested by people who claim to care about you, subscribe now. Because what comes next will show you exactly how these dynamics operate in families, friendships, and romantic relationships, and why recognizing them is the first step toward reclaiming your psychological freedom. The resentment emerges when you begin to set boundaries, express your own needs, or reduce the emotional supply you've been providing. Suddenly, the person who claimed to love you becomes angry, hurt, or punitive. They accuse you of changing, being selfish, or not caring about them anymore. Their love disappears the moment you stop functioning as their emotional resource, revealing that it was never really love at all. It was dependency masked as affection. Family relationships are often the breeding ground for the most toxic forms of disguised resentment, because they come with built-in justifications. Where family becomes the ultimate trump card that excuses behavior that would never be tolerated from strangers. Family always comes first becomes the motto that demands endless sacrifice without reciprocity. Blood is thicker than water becomes the chain that binds you to people who drain your life force while claiming it's love. Susan Forward, whose groundbreaking work on toxic family systems exposed the myths that keep people trapped in destructive relationships, understood that family dysfunction thrives on the lie that biological connection equals emotional health. Just because someone shares your DNA doesn't mean they have your best interests at heart. Just because someone raised you doesn't mean they know how to love you. Just because someone claims family loyalty doesn't mean they won't systematically undermine your well-being. The family member who resents you most deeply is often the one who talks most about family loyalty, family obligations, and family love. They use these concepts as weapons to extract compliance, silence criticism, and maintain control over your emotional life. When you try to set boundaries, they invoke family duty. When you express hurt feelings, they remind you of family forgiveness. When you consider distancing yourself, they weaponize family guilt. Watch how family resentment operates in practice. The parent who sacrificed everything for their children and now expects those children to sacrifice everything in return. The sibling who always felt less favored and now punishes you for the advantages they believe you received. The relative who appointed themselves the family caretaker and now resents everyone they've chosen to take care of. The family member who defines their identity through their family role and becomes bitter when others don't play their assigned parts. Susan Forward observed that toxic family systems often operate on the principle of emotional debt, the idea that being born into or married into a family creates automatic obligations that can never be fully repaid. The resentful family member keeps detailed accounts of everything they've done for the family and expects eternal gratitude and compliance in return. Your very existence becomes a debt you can never pay off. The most insidious aspect of family resentment is how it gets packaged as tradition, culture, and values. This is how our family works. We've always done things this way. Family takes care of family. These phrases become code for, you must accept whatever treatment we give you and be grateful for it. Your individual needs, boundaries, and well-being become secondary to maintaining the family's dysfunctional equilibrium. Family members who harbor deep resentment often hide behind roles that make their hostility difficult to identify. The worrier, who constantly predicts disaster for your choices. The realist, who always points out why your dreams won't work. The helper, who creates problems so they can solve them. The protector, who infantilizes you to maintain their sense of importance. The wise one, who offers advice designed to keep you dependent and small. The resentment in these relationships often stems from the family member's inability to create a fulfilling life outside the family system. They've invested so heavily in their family identity that they have no individual identity left. Your growth, independence, and happiness threaten their sense of purpose and control. They need you to remain small, needy, and problems-filled, because your dysfunction gives their life meaning. What makes family resentment particularly damaging is how it operates under the cover of unconditional love. When someone hurts you and then says, "But I love you," you're supposed to forget the hurt and focus on the love. When someone undermines you and then reminds you they're family, you're supposed to accept the undermining as care. When someone violates your boundaries and then talks about family loyalty, you're supposed to feel guilty for having boundaries at all. The most tragic part is how many people spend their entire lives trying to earn love from family members who are constitutionally incapable of giving it. They sacrifice their authentic selves, their individual dreams, their personal relationships, and their emotional well-being trying to transform family dysfunction into family health. But you cannot love someone into loving you properly. You cannot sacrifice enough to fill their emotional void. You cannot be small enough to make them feel big enough. When people can't express their resentment directly, either because they don't want to admit it exists or because direct confrontation feels too risky, they develop sophisticated systems of indirect punishment. Passive aggression becomes their weapon of choice, turning ordinary interactions into psychological battlefields where you're constantly under attack but can never quite prove it. Scott Wetzler, whose research on passive-aggressive behavior revealed its devastating impact on relationships, understood that this communication style is really a form of psychological warfare disguised as normal interaction. The passive-aggressive person appears cooperative on the surface, while systematically undermining, sabotaging, and punishing you through innocent mistakes, strategic delays, selective memory loss, and emotional withholding. The beauty of passive aggression from the perpetrator's perspective is its plausible deniability. When confronted about their behavior, they can always claim innocence, confusion, or good intentions. "I forgot" becomes their constant refrain. "I didn't mean it that way" becomes their defense. "You're being too sensitive" becomes their counterattack. They've created a system where they can attack you while making you look crazy for defending yourself. Consider how this plays out in daily life. They agree to help you with something important, then conveniently forget at the crucial moment. They make plans with you, then show up late with elaborate excuses that aren't quite believable. They promise to do something, then do it so poorly that you wish they hadn't done it at all. They listen to your problems, then somehow manage to bring up your flaws and failures during the conversation. The resentful person who uses passive aggression has mastered the art of the strategic inconvenience. They remember every detail about topics that interest them, but somehow can't remember commitments they've made to you. They're incredibly efficient when doing things for themselves, but mysteriously incompetent when doing things for you. They're emotionally available for everyone except you, and when you point this out, they act surprised and hurt by your observation. Scott Wetzler noted that passive-aggressive people often target the areas where you're most vulnerable or where you've explicitly asked for their support. If you've told them how important punctuality is to you, they'll be chronically late. If you've shared that you feel unheard in the relationship, they'll become mysteriously distracted whenever you're speaking. If you've expressed that you need reliability, they'll become unpredictably unreliable. The psychological toll of living with passive aggression is enormous because it requires constant vigilance and self-doubt. You find yourself questioning your own perceptions, wondering if you're imagining the patterns, feeling guilty for being suspicious of someone who appears to care about you. The passive-aggressive person's behavior is just subtle enough to make you question whether you're overreacting, but consistent enough to create genuine stress and frustration. What makes passive aggression particularly insidious is how it prevents honest communication about problems in the relationship. When someone is directly aggressive, you can address their behavior head-on. But when someone is passive-aggressive, any attempt to discuss their behavior is met with denial, deflection, and counter-accusations. They position themselves as the victim of your unfair accusations while continuing to chip away at your well-being through indirect means. The resentful person chooses passive aggression because it allows them to express their hostility while maintaining their self-image as a good person. They can punish you for existing, for needing things from them, for having needs they don't want to meet, for being different from what they expected, all while convincing themselves and others that they're trying their best and you're just difficult to please. The ultimate goal of passive-aggressive behavior is to make you feel perpetually off balance, constantly apologizing, forever trying to prove that you're not asking for too much. They want you to doubt your own needs, question your own perceptions, and accept responsibility for their inability to treat you with basic respect and consideration. They're training you to expect less and be grateful for crumbs. The first step in protecting yourself from disguised resentment is learning to trust your own emotional responses over other people's explanations of their behavior. Your nervous system doesn't lie. When you feel tense, exhausted, or constantly on edge around someone who claims to love you, your body is detecting something your mind hasn't yet processed. The resentment may be hidden, but its effects on you are real and measurable. Judith Lewis Herman, whose work on psychological trauma includes the subtle trauma of emotional manipulation, understood that healing begins with validation of your own experience. When someone's behavior consistently leaves you feeling drained, confused, or somehow wrong, you don't need their permission to acknowledge that the dynamic is unhealthy. You don't need proof that would hold up in court. You need to honor your own emotional reality. Start paying attention to the patterns rather than getting lost in individual incidents. The person who harbors secret resentment will reveal it through consistency over time, not through any single dramatic event. Notice how you feel before, during, and after interactions with them. Notice whether their help actually helps or creates more problems. Notice whether their concern feels supportive or undermining. Notice whether their love energizes you or depletes you. Learn to recognize the language of disguised resentment. "I'm just worried about you" often means, "I don't want you to succeed." "I'm just being realistic" usually means, "I need you to fail to validate my own limitations." "I'm just trying to help" frequently means, "I need you to remain dependent on me." "We're family/friends" often means, "You're not allowed to have boundaries with me." Start listening to what people mean, not just what they say. Judith Lewis Herman emphasized that healing from psychological manipulation requires building a support system outside the toxic dynamic. You need people in your life who can reflect back your worth without expecting constant emotional labor in return. You need relationships where your success is celebrated rather than resented, where your growth is encouraged rather than sabotaged, where your well-being matters as much as everyone else's. Set boundaries based on your own needs, not on other people's capacity to respect them. The person who resents you will never willingly give you the space you need to heal and grow. They will interpret every boundary as rejection, every act of self-care as selfishness, every step toward independence as betrayal. You cannot wait for their permission to protect your own emotional well-being. Understand that you cannot love someone into resolving their resentment toward you. Their resentment exists because of their own unhealed wounds, unmet needs, and unresolved psychological issues. No amount of accommodation, appreciation, or self-sacrifice on your part will fix what's broken inside them. You can only control your own behavior and responses. Practice emotional detachment without becoming emotionally closed. This means learning to observe their resentful behavior without taking it personally, without trying to fix it, without accepting responsibility for their emotional state. You can acknowledge that they're struggling without making their struggle your emergency. You can feel compassion for their pain without letting their pain become your burden. The hardest part of dealing with disguised resentment is accepting that some people who claim to love you are not safe emotional partners. They may mean well on some level, but their unresolved issues make them incapable of supporting your growth, celebrating your successes, or honoring your autonomy. Loving someone doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment they give you. Sometimes loving yourself means limiting contact with people whose love damages your well-being. Remember that their resentment is information about them, not about you. You are not too much, too needy, too sensitive, or too demanding simply because someone resents your existence, your happiness, or your needs. Their inability to love you properly is a reflection of their limitations, not your worth. The people who love you while secretly resenting you have taught you a fundamental lie, that love requires your diminishment. They've convinced you that caring relationships demand constant sacrifice, endless accommodation, and the perpetual management of other people's emotional states at the expense of your own. They've trained you to believe that setting boundaries is selfish, that having needs is burdensome, and that your happiness somehow threatens the stability of your relationships. But here's what Alice Miller knew, what Susan Forward revealed, what Judith Lewis Herman understood. Real love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller. Authentic care doesn't come with hidden price tags. Genuine affection doesn't transform into resentment when you start growing, succeeding, or claiming space for your own emotional needs. The resentment you've been sensing isn't imaginary. The exhaustion you feel around certain people isn't oversensitivity. The sense that something is wrong despite their protests of love isn't paranoia. You've been living in relationships where love has been weaponized against your well-being, where care has been used to control your behavior, where family bonds and friendship ties have become chains that bind you to people who cannot celebrate your authentic self. The most liberating truth you can accept is that you don't owe anyone your psychological destruction in exchange for their version of love. You don't have to be grateful for treatment that harms you. You don't have to honor relationships that dishonor your humanity. You don't have to remain loyal to people whose loyalty to you is conditional on your willingness to remain small, needy, and manageable. Breaking free from these dynamics will feel like rebellion because to them it is rebellion. When you stop accepting resentment disguised as love, when you refuse to manage other people's emotions at the expense of your own, when you choose relationships based on how they actually treat you rather than how they claim to feel about you, you're overthrowing the entire system that has kept you trapped. The people who have been secretly resenting you will not celebrate your liberation. They will intensify their efforts to pull you back into the familiar patterns. They will escalate their guilt tripping, increase their emotional manipulation, and amplify their claims of hurt and abandonment. This reaction isn't proof that you're wrong. It's proof that you're finally on the right track. You deserve relationships where your growth is celebrated rather than resented. You deserve love that energizes rather than depletes you. You deserve care that supports your authentic self rather than demanding your continual performance of a more convenient version of who you are. But understanding resentment is only the beginning. Because once you see how these patterns operate in your personal relationships, you'll start noticing them everywhere. In your workplace, where your success threatens insecure colleagues. In social groups, where your authenticity disrupts comfortable pretenses. In communities that claim to value growth but punish anyone who actually changes. The resentment runs deeper than individual relationships. It's woven into the fabric of a society that teaches people to compete for scraps of validation rather than creating abundance together. A culture that mistakes emotional manipulation for love, dysfunction for loyalty, and psychological control for care. The question isn't just, why do people who love me resent me? The question is, why does our entire social system create people who can't love without resenting, who can't give without keeping score, who can't support others without undermining them? That's a question that goes to the very core of how we've been programmed to relate to each other. And it's a question that, once answered, will change not just how you see your relationships, but how you see the entire world around you. Subscribe if you're ready to go deeper. Because what we've uncovered today about individual resentment is just the surface of something much larger, much more systematic, and much more powerful. The real work begins when you understand that the problem isn't just with the people who resent you, it's with the entire system that created them. The revolution starts with seeing clearly, and you're just getting started.